time to prepare all that.
So look, because if you mention something, he can show the tips. You don't have to prepare them. And that's it.
I can find elements today.
No, what I was going to suggest is that if the clips, I noticed that there are some interesting points that Satoshi made that also struck me in terms of the visual. There's that bit, for instance, when the father is talking about Shankara, and he's talking about Gita at that time. That particular group of visuals is quite interesting. Maybe something that one could refer to. So I was just wondering whether, when we do the Q&A, we could just bring up some of these things, and then you could make a note of some of the things that was referred to, and then show them. It may be easier. May also give you a bit of time towards the end of the, or during the Q&A to prepare something. Yeah. I come. I think in many ways I'm the outsider here. So it's a curiosity for me as well as a difficulty, I think, for you. In the sense that I'm not used to handling either visuals or, shall we say, cultural images in much of my work. And as Gayatri said, that perhaps my long association with various institutions of the government became responsible to this. The point is though that I have always felt somewhere that in a, shall we say, a very solid dimension, it's important to deal with many things which that solid dimension kind of constitutes around it. So I've normally been a good listener when it comes to many of the issues that have been talked about when you're dealing with both imagery as well as artifact in the world of both culture and, shall we say, emotive and affectual experience. Now, that is a kind of basis from which I've tried to make this little statement, okay, over the next 20-25 minutes. I must say first and foremost, I haven't seen all the films thoroughly, and I've seen them at different times. I'm afraid the links did not work, but the one thing, it doesn't matter, okay? The one thing that I was able to do is to look very, very carefully at Srivatna Rekha, which I didn't want to do, okay? Because Srivatna Rekha was simply MP4, and there was no difficulty in my getting it. On the other hand, I've seen Legacy before, and I've seen Kavananda before, so in fact I have 3 of the films clearly in my mind. In addition, I found the articles fascinating. I really think to me it opened up something which was very exciting, for reasons I would mention. I would like really just to highlight 3 major points. And the first 2 I will just skip through very quickly, and the third I will deal with in slightly greater length. I came across, and I think this is important, and I elaborate. I came across Legacy in a very unusual time of my life, and in a very unusual place. I saw this film as part of a set of 3. I've seen it again and again afterwards, which were being filmed at the time of Uhuru in Kenya. That is in the 1962-63 period. And I was then hardly 12, 13 years old. However, it was a set of 3 films that were put on Kenyan Broadcasting Corporation television, and therefore had a very, very specific audience. I.e., it had an audience which was composed of an Indian elite, an African elite, and a departing settler colony. And it was being shown at a time when Indian films of this type were very, very rarely seen in Kenya. because the cinematic culture of Kenya actually involved a very large offtake of Hindi material, which was shown in something like 5 major cinema halls, which affected all the different communities simultaneously. So the images of India really came from the export of those Hindi films, playing to relatively packed audiences, sometimes driving audiences at that time, by 62, 63. And I realized that all 3 communities, that is, and they were very distinct communities at that time, even though the Indian community was a heavily divided one, so were the other 2, as I came to find out later, but we never saw that, actually used to attend these performances. The only distinction being that the English never confessed that they went to an English film. Okay, the settlers' children never mentioned it. I've come to understand this many years later because many settler autobiographies of their children and their families continuously refer to the fact that they would occasionally go off and see these films quietly around the corner because they seem to be something different. So certainly it was part of a composite space, cultural space at that time. And these 3 actually, the 3 are Patak Panchali, Aparajita, and Megarasta. These 3 were shown on KBC at that time before it became real. So actually it was a kind of dominion status kind of projection. It was somewhere in transition that the films were shown. I must say that for me at that time, actually it was for 10 years after, these films were repeatedly part of a kind of sense of what the Indian film was at its most serious. I showed the films again when I was at university in Cambridge, when Contemporary Films or Connoisseur Films, I can't remember which is the main distributor of these films, was busy actually distributing these 3 plus RTP, I think, at that time. There were 4 major Indian films that were normally doing the international circuit. So to me, that's what, I mean, other than the Hindi film, which of course I saw my Sholay, etc., occasionally saw whatever must on the slide. Nevertheless, this was something else. And I think this is very important because the people who were showing it on KBC were a cultural side of the Indian embassy. And Prem Bhatia and others who were journalists were involved in this because they were taking over as, I mean, he had been a serious journalist, part of the national movement, and he had actually come in as ambassador. They were very keen on showing something other than the Hindi film. And the impression that all 3 left with me is of a kind of quintessential set of images of this extremely rich and powerful ambience of rural life or of simplicity in which people were highly intelligent, but in which there was a certain darkness. And however positive some of the impressions that were left by all 3 films were, there were positive impressions. There was this darkness actually separated India. And as a young boy growing up, as it were, in a nationalist sentiment-based family, this India actually automatically separated from the Hollywood movie. The Hollywood movie was about drama, it was about comedy, it was about detection, it was about all sorts of things, but this is something else. It represented, and I use all these words advisedly, it represented a totally different space. And I really felt a degree both of pride as well as of I wouldn't say distance, but of a distant involvement with something which is mine, which is not mine, and which I think somewhere was a major image that the Indian embassy wished to produce of India at that time. I want to emphasize that these were highly emotive images, so that in fact the death of Durga, the long descriptions of the death of the mother in Aparajita, in that concluding area, the gradual disintegration of Nita as she takes on responsibilities, and then that terrible blackness where you see her tuberculosis in that particular room, totally sick and emaciated. These are images which have remained with me practically the whole of my life. Okay, so these somewhere frame the character of a sense of India, which I want to point out was being projected into an international space. That's the thing. This is not a reflection on Bengal or a reflection of one Indian or another Indian within India. This is an image that was being put out, and I think we received it as such. Very important, I think, was that all three were heavy narratives. There were no assertive dialogues. I mean, there was nothing in any of those three films in the way I saw them which made me think in terms of language thinking. That is, I did not think of categories, I did not think of challenges, and I'll point out the difference in a minute, a bit more elegantly. But they were very, very powerful images of what this country was all about. Okay, so I think Ritwik Ghatak somewhere slipped into this sense of things for me at that time, and I think it slipped into the sensibility of large numbers of people. I mean, the important thing is that this was not the cinema; it was TV that was actually putting this out. It was not put out on the general circuit of the Sham or the Bellevue or the two other Victorias, five Hindi cinema places in Nairobi. So now, after this is the second. My first point is made up of two units. I did see very early on in the 1970s, late 1970s, early 1980s, Moinak. And it shattered my sense of what an Indian art film was about. At that time there were huge numbers of art films, and in fact, somewhere or another, it set a different pedigree. Suddenly, there was this discussion, this discursive domain, this playing with different kinds of levels of imagery, etc., all came out very forcefully in the course of that film, which made me think that there was something very, very exciting, which had gone before the art film in the history of the Indian film, other than the kind of images that I had seen during the 1960s. I mean, those were not kind of great and powerful images, but there was intellection here. There was something else. So whoever it was that had made that Mega Dakatara had a different dimension. But that was the end of my dialogue with Ritwik Ghatak at that time. I just did not pursue Ritwik Ghatak beyond that. I simply registered that something was there in the past, which really, before this entire slew of movies that came out in the late 70s, early 80s, Art Club, etc., all the ones with Smita Patil, Manthan, I mean, the whole lot of films that came out in the late 70s, early 80s. So that, and even more than these films, that was subtle. There was so much in it in terms of just the use of the word, the repeated use of the word, which in a strange way had not been the case when I had seen Mega Dakatara, where actually it was an intense and grueling story which I was seeing unfold. So those two images of Ghatak somewhere, one which is in an international sphere, but one which led me to question that reception that I had received in the international sphere. Those are 2 points I would like to just lay on the line. Now, owing to Moinak's generosity and hard work, I was able to see Shubha and read the articles. I just very briefly say how I respond to both things. the Subharna Rekha, I think, for me was an eye-opener in many ways, in the sense that what I saw is in Komalbandar a profoundly intellectual engagement with the visual. Actually has so many different aspects to it which were global in character. And that is something which I had never seen in the first three films when I encountered them in Kenya. And I never really associated with Ritwik Ghatak at all, in any sense. First and foremost, there is this continuous focus at Ghatak on the aeroplane, the airport, and somewhere or another, as a result, this domain of something which is far outside and beyond India, in terms of the technology of everyday life, and the technology of modern industry, in the sense of the mill itself, which India had already appropriated after all. And even, shall we say, something else which is quite clearly part of a kind of middle class ambience in terms of the race course in Calcutta and things like that, which somewhere you see in the course of the visit by our main protagonist, by what's his name? I forget the name. The both of the Nishan Harpita will come together. So in Calcutta. So this larger space regarding the Sputnik, all these clearly are very much part of Ritwik's domain. And even more exciting, all these discussions and debates which occur between the two of them, both before and during the last meeting, which indicates a kind of grand lexicon of kind of reflections on conflict, on concession, all of which somewhere obviously touches left-wing discussion and debate during that era and before. That is all takes this thing firmly out of the tremendously effective and emotive images which actually located in a visual space, but which do not allow it to breathe something more, which is a kind of discursive space. Okay? The intellection in every sense, together with the world, is somewhere there in Subharna Rekha. And I was really wondering whether, it was just part of the way in which Grachila has been visualized, etc., etc. And then I began reading the articles, and I realized that these are conscious interventions, properly thought out, understood, in which he not only is dealing with each of his visuals deliberately, introduced them deliberately, focused on them, and linked deliberately, but far more important, he has actually been continuously cross-referencing from a very broad reading as well as a visual experience concerning how to constitute. This was, this is the first time I've seen Subharna Rekha. I have not seen it before. Alright? So I'd seen the other two, and I was actually quite thrilled by this, and I shall now pursue a Gayatri can also prove it. I was too, with quite clearly the issue of the mechanical is on different levels. I mean, it's not one level only. And there is both an issue of decay, modernity, global, etc., all of which somewhere figure in the story. Now, on the basis of this, therefore, I began to, the articles then took me into something else. I mean, partition I had always somewhere accepted and understood as being tremendously part of both a Bengali ethos as well as a Bengali discursive space. I mean, not simply engaging with something but talking about it. And displacement quite clearly has always featured in a way in which I could not quite touch it, because I myself have never I didn't realize I had experienced displacement in that way, but somewhere or another, increasingly as you see Ritwik, you begin to understand that everybody experiences displacement. displacement in some way or another. It's simply how you read it and where you stand with it. Now, it was at this time that I began to ask, well, he had this global scope, and from the articles I understood the displacement and partition were very, very important. I said, well, was he engaging with something within that global scope in which displacement was handled as a problem? And the first thing immediately that this took me to was the fact that it was his references. I mean, who is he referring to? And where, what kind of films did they make during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and what was he seeing? So then I actually began looking through the articles in order to find out the names. And I realized that first and foremost, when it came to Soviet cinema, which quite clearly as a member of the IPTA, etc., he had been exposed to, I had a number of questions to ask. As a historian, I wanted immediately to know, he said we had watched all these clandestine. How did we watch them clandestine? Were they part really? So, was it part of a local space of viewing? Because in the normal books, Rajashri Das Gupta, Professor Rai, Anuradha Rai, and Jalapur, etc., in the recent fellings of the IPTA and the left cultural movements in India, I never quite found out how the global left and the Indian left had actually managed to get together in a visual space. When passing literature is one thing, moving literature and also to a certain degree as a result theatrical activity was one thing. But actually seeing films, a very, very different thing, especially given the technology of that time. No DVDs, no VCRs, etc. I'm curious about how this material passed on. Or had it been that somehow or another he had gained access to it in some other space. But do you think they were travel? So it's not as if he went off to London and he watched it there. So obviously there was something else put here in the 40s and 50s, which is a curiosity to a historian. I mean, a historian of Indian left culture. Sorry, I've gone on too long. No, I think I'm on. I think I'm So that was firstly just a historical curiosity. The second thing is that I began to think about the displacement issue. And I realized actually none of those films, even though, by the way, displacement is a classic experience of the whole of the world of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe during this period. One thing which is very, very seldom discussed in those films is displacement. Because for various reasons, the trauma of war and having to find your feet again always is discussed in much of the films of the 40s and 50s in terms of going back home. It is not discussed in terms of a kind of eternal alienation from the space of work. Now, this I think is part of a particular Soviet cosmopolitan ethos which was actually generated under Stalin during the 1930s and 1940s, which is that somewhere or another the world was composed of many different peoples, and it was very important to understand that experiences were highly varied. But all these experiences were locationally specific. They had boundaries around them. People moved across and beyond those boundaries. And finally, they had a sensibility that lay beyond the ethnic and national space in which they had once been grounded. But nevertheless, for them to lead lives which were homogeneous in many ways, and which inevitably involved many, many different experiences, that was not something that was up for discussion at that particular time. And there is a kind of Stalinist cosmopolitan that Katrina Clark is busy now completely outlining for the East. She's integrating Iran, India, and China into her next book, in which she points this particular thing out. And I began to see, when I began thinking about the films of that era, that this is true. So when Ritwik actually comes up with this, and it's very interesting when you look through the content of his reference, he's actually not talking about issues that are being discussed, that he learns from. He's talking about the technology that frequently is being discussed in terms of, or technology both soft and hard, in terms of Pudovkin, in terms of Eisenstein, etc., which is of some excitement. I mean, that's the thing which moves it. It's not something which gives us food for thought in a direct sense, dealing with the displacement issue from the international left engagement. This doesn't mean that the left engagement internationally is not of value, in the sense that this issue of both of oppression, of segregation, the necessity to fight, conflict, all these things come from that particular culture. The issue, the cardinal issue of displacement, I don't think, is something that he grew up from there. So, as I said, about these films, by the way, it was interesting. The only film really that I saw of that era, and by that time he was dead, which really dealt with some of the issues that he was dealing with, was a film by Zoltan Fabri, which comes very late in his corpus, which is called The Hungarians, which is just before he deals with Ballad Fabia meets God, and after he deals with The Fifth Seal, in which he deals with Magyar movements across Europe and taking residence in Germany during the course of the Second World War, where actually he does touch on this issue of the gradual disintegration of identity and personality. But he leaves it as a sorry and unfortunate outcome. And finally, the thing that it stands with is the sole person out of this group of people who is conscious of himself and who is able to return home. Quote unquote, I am the last Hungarian. So it does occur, but I think because of the character of the engagements of that time, generated in the 30s, 40s, and 50s for cinema and the tropes that were involved, I don't think it was something which was serious. Now, I would like very quickly here to add two things. First is a point. I think I can do this properly. First is a point regarding my watching the films. And now, since I know Bengali and have kind of used it off and on, I'm not saying I know very well, over the years, there is a terrible problem about the translation issue. And I think it demeans the experiences that the person is attempting to convey. And I think the life of the films outside their own space, and I must congratulate you on the translation of the articles, because I occasionally quickly managed to find the odd Bengali to cross-refer to. But the subtitles are, especially because in Kolkata and Chakraborty, when they're dealing with challenges, I mean, these actually really render what is at issue very, very, shall we say, under-prosaic. I mean, it's terrible. Okay, I think there is, but I think I want to highlight this as a problem rather than simply as a criticism. And it is a problem because an entire image of Ritwik somewhere in a global space has to be undertaken within this framework of subtitling and presentation. So if this is to be understood within to the fullness of the experience, there has to be some kind of re-engagement with them. And I mean, Barbara Cassan was kind of talked a lot about this. and I think this is clearly more a problem that you're familiar with than I'm immediately, but I think this is something which, if somewhere or another there has to be something more that is thought and said about it, it needs to be done. Okay? The last point occurred because of that, okay? Which is, I have never really thought of, I mean, when we think of migration today and displacement in this traumatic manner, I think we think of this as a series of contemporary problems, whether they occur in West Africa, sections of East Africa, that is the Sudan, Ethiopia, northern Kenyan space, or in terms of Southeast Asia, which we're dealing with at the moment, the Myanmar-Bangladesh border. So very, very specific issues come to mind. And a kind of literature which is scientific in nature, which is generated about much of this. And somewhere, I think we fail to understand the story of the past in terms of its visual representation in the past. I'm not talking about, I mean, prose has clearly done its job. But I think Ritwik Ghatak here, and I can now begin to see it, is a very, very important contemporary figure in the sense of the problems that he is touching. And I think especially for these people, who are people who really are doomed never to having a home, and living with the experience of not having a home, knowing that that home exists, and somewhere or another having been totally alienated by the people they have lived with from an experience of re-engagement. I think this is a great example of this, but I sometimes wonder whether we cannot think of other areas where really many of the problems that Ritwik is highlighting cannot be taken up in this. This is something I wanted to say. Sometimes because of the fact that you're formal, whether in terms of the things you are brought up with, the things you're responding to, or the things that you sympathize with in terms of movements, when the formal ceases to have enough space for you to actually project yourself, this issue of silliness or comedy or laughter, I think is an important thing that the person who is trying to project an idea.
Or self-staging in something that is
yes.
only recognized as autobiography.
Yeah.
That's a very complicated issue.
Yeah. You see, I was thinking about it a little bit because, with Malayalam, there's in the literature of the late 19th, early 20th century, there are formal engagements which take place which actually deal with the sense. Bengal has actually written it this way, this is the way in which we should write it, etc. And literally there's a way in which the historical novel is based on a certain referencing of the story. But there are a series of marginal writers who have been now given the term of satirist or parodyist, etc., who really don't know what they wish to write, and who therefore play with all sorts of things and create really very outrageous long pieces of prose, which are part of the standard literature. And that was a very interesting response to these things. And I'm wondering whether it's a persistent response. I mean, in colonial or in non-formalized spaces, whether in fact this is not the way in which people actually engage with problems, which is that the formal space is not giving me my terrain and something else. And that Parangadi, really I came very much as a person who felt that I was completely at sea in this, and especially because I don't know Ghatak very well, and I certainly know from drinking sessions with Moinak at least that I'm dealing with a very complex phenomenon, and there are many people who understand its complexity, so I didn't quite understand why Gayatri wanted me present, but I came. And as I prepared for it, there was something that I felt that certainly I could take away and perhaps even contribute. And so my focus initially was on the contribution, and I really felt that two things that I thought I would put on the table were my own response, or my own set of responses to what I was seeing and reading in terms of the way in which I encountered Ghatak first, and thereby actually to somehow open out the notion of a Bengali audience, an Indian audience, to a world Indian audience. And not just a world Indian audience, but one which was actually responding to that Indianness in different ways, but was actually not Indian at all. Even they were African, they were white settler, they came from all sorts of different positions. So I thought I would at least try and put that on the table so that that would be something that people could think about, rather than the interiority that was normally easily a point of attraction in a lot of what he was putting up. The second thing which really links to my own learning of this was that I never really located Ghatak as a member of a community which is responding to international left ideas. Even though I somewhere understood that it was part of a particular spectrum of left thought within Bengal, and perhaps in India, I kind of kept him very much at home. I had limited his location very specifically to this habitat and nothing more. I think partially because of the lack of so-called movement of the films into a larger sphere, i.e. other than Megadakatara, and secondly, also because they're Bengali films, and I had not seen them pushed around as much as I had seen Satyajit Ray, etc. So that was something which intrigued me, and really I thought I would raise a set of questions concerning that in terms of that international left, which is that how far did certainly the crucial issue of displacement, which he says in that Shubhanareka discussion, was central to his long concerns, and that too displacement in all sorts of different ways. Not simply the partition itself, which other people say is crucial to him, but also many other forms of things and experiences which were linked to that issue of displacement that comes from that partition. So somewhere or another I thought that that needed to be understood in terms both in association with and distinction from a set of images which are generated in the international left about these matters. And I thought that since the Soviet states' overwhelming presence in the shaping of the IPTA and its reference points, etc., as well as the Comintern and post-Comintern experiences were very, very important to this, that somewhere or another one should look at the way in which these issues were discussed in that dimension. But so those are the two things that I thought that I would, as it were, come prepared with, and those are the things that I spoke about. But I must say that at the end of it I did include, because Gayatri had actually placed this very powerful image on the screen. It did strike me that this enormous contemporaneity of this set of questions is also something that we should consider if we're thinking about this person as something more than locationally rooted, embedded in one particular fixed and delimited kind of space. So that I ended up with. But I must say, I had expected something, and frankly I got it. It was very, very nice for me to learn. So let me just mention this kind of point number 2 of what I've learned, which is, somewhere or another, working with history, one deals with both specific issues of date, specific issues of figure, biography, event, etc. And one weaves a set of aporia around these things. That is the way in which you gradually begin to make sense of an act or a time, and gradually you begin to see a set of connections within these. But how you go about actually proceeding with the aporia is something which is non-specific. So, and there is a kind of hegemony that a particular form of social sciences has in the way in which you deal with this. And whether it be a critical social science or a standard structural social science, it doesn't matter. It's there. I mean, there are established hegemonies which exist in the way in which this is actually.
It's behind all the multidisciplinary talk.
That's right.
The real methods courses are only taught to the ones who are in the discipline.
That's right.
Yes.
Okay. So the thing though that is something that is very fresh is to have a set of readings which deal with the interiority of the subject. But the interiority of the subject itself does not actually have to be handled purely in terms of specific aspects of the language as well as the detail. That particular set of questions, I thought, is the meat of the way in which these associations with that international level, the contribution really to that international level, that is something that can be opened up and investigated. And there actually these issues that the Rupa actually raised concerning about childhood, about the home, these as well as a number of questions that you raised concerning the staging of the work. That is, how far in fact is the work more and more staged towards the end. That was something which and you emphasized that, but actually it was your take on it which linked with something that I had mentioned generally. And the way in which you actually saw this as part of the way in which he was trying to communicate. These things, I don't think, were quite part of a general debate which at that time, the IPTA on the one hand, and the discussions of cultural cosmopolitanism in the 30s and 40s actually generated. Now, this was something, and how you explain those tropes and the way in which you dealt with them. And I go back to what I had said about displacement. The way in which he made a different kind of displacement central to what he said. All these things led me to think about the experience of this man within this framework of what we consider a kind of great critique, as it were, of capitalism, which is the international critique and its consolidation within a particular format during the course of the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And the independence, in a way, of this, at the same time as taking up the links and connections from it. This was something that very seriously opened up a number of issues for me. So that, in fact, the broader subject of the way in which this international operated, which is of concern to me and has been in the recent past, is something which I really am able now to develop using what I have heard from you. And that is something that I really did.
Hari, I have a question. When was M.N. Roy born, roughly? Roughly.
1890s.
1890s, right?
Yeah.
So a previous generation, because the so Covington connection, as we have discussed many a time, M.N. Roy and Hari, and the idea that here it's agricultural, here it's agricultural, and there it's proletarian and factory-based, etc. See, the rural, we thought. But on the other hand, Ghatak is very smart. Ghatak speaking to us directly about modernity and tradition. No, it's within quotation marks, it's a staging of that absurd thing. Which, the reason that since you said, I don't know why Gayatri put me in, it's exactly what you're saying, and also the way he was responding. It's because the discipline has to be opened up. What does the discipline do? It trains us as to how to know. It's an epistemological training. It's not so easy, and bad people think that that is the only way to know. See, one of my advantages, if I may say so, is that I have never had a philosophy course, either undergraduate or graduate. Nobody has ever taught me disciplinary philosophy. The advantage, the disadvantage is I can't philosophize. I should recognize that. But, on the other hand, I do know that smaller disciplinary people who are caught within the discipline and think that's the only way to know. John Searle, for example, other philosophers, when they say to you, I don't understand, what they mean is you do not fulfill the conditions of intelligibility. That's what they mean, because they're within their bloody discipline. And there again, I want to bring gendering in again and again. My way of dealing with this, in Saudi Arabia with a men in London University, with John Searle himself live on Channel 4, television, etc., has always been to take the only position of power that apart from everything else, men, all men are not the same, but you have to generalize. So it's not a question of what kind of genitals you're sitting on, but it's a kind of set of attitudes, right? So let me use the word men. In general, what do we do? And this is a warning also about the word West, right? So men generally find not a daughter, not a mother, not a girlfriend, not a mistress, not any of these people, but a nanny, a G. That power, that power is one that they find it very difficult to withhold. So when I'm with these philosophers, disciplinary philosophers, who I know will tell me I don't understand, my answer is I keep my role of the nanny, the indulgence nanny. And so I say, let's try again. And it's very hard for the philosopher to be taken literally here, rather than be, Jivan used to say, not to be political, turn the metaphor into something literal. Then rather than to silence you by saying, sorry, you don't fulfill the conditions of intelligibility. That's why I invited you. Because your attitude toward the discipline. See, Bimal Krishna Motilal and Jacques Derrida, these are the two people I have met who are much, out of comparison smarter than I am. I could never even hope to be anywhere close to them. And they certainly were much more, it's been my great fortune that I was close to them. So the thing is that that's what they longed for, to get out of the imprisonment of the discipline. It's a very hard, because generally people shut you up with disciplinary stuff, right? And I have learned not to try to do it, because I do try, because I'm not as big as they are. Because we learn from the singular and the unverifiable, right? The humanities teachers. You want to teach information. Imaginative activism. So therefore, it's okay, I'm skipping. But at any rate, therefore, I would like to answer your question of I don't know why that you invited me. I really did invite you because your attitude toward your disciplinary production is one of, get me out of here. You know what I mean? Rather than, these people are not historians. You know what I mean? And Romina is like that too. So this is a great difference between the ones who use it to shut you up. And unfortunately, I have that tendency. And so I have to watch it in terms of my friends who are not like that. Among them you, among them Moinak. So that's why.
No, I'm very grateful. And I think I've learned a lot. I must say about Abhishek, I've always thought that the practitioner has a major role in making us think also about precisely what we think about rather than we do. So it was very useful to have this issue of theatre and the way you think about it, and what you consider, not necessarily what you would personally consider acceptable, but what you considered other people would consider acceptable, being put on the table. Which is that, you had said that if you went to New York or you went to London and you were actually giving this particular script, then in fact this is what they would do to you. That actually, and placing a degree of distance there, and giving yourself a different specific location, that was rather interesting. Because in a way it also brought into this room a series of other practitioners, and the way, and many of the people that Gayatri has been referring to in the realm of disciplinary discussions, you are actually bringing into the room in terms of practical encounters with this kind of a problem and this kind of a subject. So that again I found extremely useful.
Which is also a discipline.
Yes.